The plague god's touch comes in many forms. Sometimes it arrives as a disease, a pestilence that spreads through the ranks of Imperial Guard regiments trapped in the trenches of endless war. The soldiers feel the first symptoms as minor discomforts, a persistent cough, a fever that will not break, lesions that appear on skin exposed to contaminated environments. Medical officers prescribe standard treatments, but the afflictions persist, spreading from one warrior to the next despite quarantine protocols and the desperate prayers of regimental priests. The infected begin to change in subtle ways. Pain that should be unbearable becomes manageable, almost distant. Wounds that should kill instead fester and weep but refuse to finish their grim work. The dying discover they cannot die, trapped in bodies that continue to function even as they rot from within. For the Adeptus Astartes, those transhuman warriors created to be humanity's finest defenders, the corruption follows different vectors but arrives at the same destination. Space Marines are designed to resist all manner of toxins and diseases, their modified physiology capable of processing poisons that would liquefy an ordinary human's organs in seconds. Yet Nurgle's gifts bypass these defenses through the one vulnerability that even the Emperor's angels possess, the soul. A space marine who has fought for centuries, who has witnessed the death of worlds and the failure of crusades, who has seen his brothers fall to enemies too numerous to count, carries within him a weight of accumulated trauma that even hypno-indoctrination cannot fully suppress. This psychological burden creates cracks in the armour of faith, fissures through which the plague god's influence seeps like contaminated groundwater. The Death Guard stand as the most infamous example of this corruption, an entire legion that fell to Nurgle's embrace during the Horus Heresy. Their Primarch, Mortarion, led them into damnation not through weakness, but through a twisted form of love for his sons. Trapped in the warp by the machinations of their former brother Typhon, the Death Guard fleet found itself becalmed in a realm where reality's rules held no sway. A plague of supernatural origin swept through the ships, a disease that even Astarte's physiology could not resist. It reduced the proud warriors of the 14th Legion to writhing masses of agony, their enhanced bodies prolonging the suffering rather than ending it mercifully. Mortarion himself resisted for as long as any being could, watching his sons succumb one by one, their screams echoing through the Vox channels as they begged for relief that would not come. The Primarch's breaking point came not from his own suffering but from witnessing theirs. When Mortarion finally called out to any power that might end his legion's torment, Nurgle answered with what seemed like salvation. The pain stopped. The death that had been approaching for weeks or months, time having lost all meaning in the warp, suddenly reversed. The Death Guard rose from their beds of filth, their bodies transformed but functional, their minds released from agony into a state of strange contentment. They had been reborn as plague marines, their armour fused to rotting flesh, their organs exposed through gaps in ceramite plating, their blood replaced with pus and ichor. Yet they felt no distress at their condition. The despair that had driven Mortarion to his desperate plea had been replaced with something far more insidious, acceptance and even joy in their new state. This transformation represents the ultimate horror of Nurgle's corruption. The chosen of the plague god do not simply become diseased or disfigured. They undergo a fundamental alteration of consciousness that redefines their relationship with suffering itself. Where once they would have recoiled from decay and putrefaction, they now embrace it as natural and even beautiful. The stench of gangrene becomes a perfume, the sight of exposed intestines a thing of wonder, the sensation of flesh sloughing from bone a minor inconvenience at worst. This psychological inversion is far more profound than mere physical mutation. It represents the death of the self as it once existed, and the birth of something that retains memories and skills, but views reality through a lens so fundamentally altered that communication with the uninfected becomes nearly impossible. The process varies in duration and intensity depending on the individual. Some succumb quickly, their resistance worn down by circumstances that leave them vulnerable to corruption. A guardsman trapped in a plague-ridden battlefield, watching his comrades dissolve into puddles of liquefied tissue, might accept Nurgle's gift within hours if it means an end to witnessing such atrocities. Others resist for years or even decades, their faith or stubborn will creating barriers that slow but cannot ultimately prevent their fall. The Imperium's records contain accounts of garrison commanders who held plague-infected fortresses for months beyond any reasonable expectation, their bodies visibly rotting even as they continued to issue coherent orders and maintain military discipline. These individuals exist in a twilight state, neither fully alive nor entirely transformed, their humanity eroding with each passing day until the final barrier crumbles and Nurgle claims them completely. The physical transformations that accompany this spiritual corruption manifest in ways unique to each individual, though certain patterns emerge across all of Nurgle's chosen. The body ceases to maintain the boundaries between internal and external, with organs becoming visible through transparent or absent skin, intestines trailing from ruptures in the abdomen, bones protruding through flesh that no longer properly contains them. Yet these catastrophic injuries do not disable the corrupted. A plague marine can function perfectly well with half his skull missing, his brain exposed to vacuum and yet still capable of tactical thought and weapon operation. The supernatural vitality granted by Nurgle keeps the body animated regardless of injuries that would kill any normal organism 1,000 times over. Swelling becomes another common feature, tissues bloating with accumulated fluids and gases produced by unnatural fermentation processes occurring within the corrupted flesh. Plague marines often grow significantly larger than their uncorrupted battle brothers, their armour straining and eventually rupturing to accommodate bodies that have inflated to grotesque proportions. This swelling is not uniform but occurs in patches and nodes, creating asymmetrical silhouettes that offend the eye with their wrongness. Tumorous growths erupt from random locations, some recognisable as distorted organs, others defying anatomical classification entirely. These growths pulse with their own rhythms, independent of the heartbeat if such still exists, creating a disturbing visual effect that suggests multiple entities cohabiting a single body. The skin itself undergoes radical changes, losing its elasticity and structural integrity. It becomes paper-thin in some areas, tearing at the slightest touch to reveal the suppurating meat beneath. In other locations it thickens into calloused plaques, or develops a texture like tree bark, cracked and seeping. Colours shift from healthy human tones through the spectrum of decay, from pallid white to sickly yellow, greenish-grey, purple-black, and every shade between. These colours often exist in patches on the same individual, creating a mottled appearance that speaks to different stages and types of putrefaction, occurring simultaneously. Limbs elongate or contract according to no consistent pattern. An arm might grow an additional metre in length, while its opposite number withers to a useless stump. Fingers fuse together or multiply, creating hands with too many or too few digits, none of which necessarily correspond to human proportions. Joints reverse or add new articulation points, allowing movement in directions that should be anatomically impossible. These modifications somehow enhance combat effectiveness, rather than hindering it, the corrupted warrior adapting to use their malformed anatomy with disturbing proficiency. The face, that most human of features, becomes a canvas for Nurgle's twisted artistry. Eyes sink into deep pits or bulge from their sockets, sometimes migrating to new locations on the skull entirely. The nose collapses or extends into a tubular proboscis. Mouths widen beyond the boundaries of the jaw, or lips seal shut while new orifices open in cheeks or throat. Teeth rot and fall away, or multiply into shark-like rows, or transform into bony protrusions that pierce through gums and cheeks. The tongue swells to proportions that make speech nearly impossible, or desiccates to a leathery strip, or splits into multiple appendages. Through all these changes, the eyes often retain a glimmer of awareness, a terrible consciousness that observes its own degradation with something approaching satisfaction. The most horrifying aspect of these physical transformations is their apparent lack of effect on the victim's self-perception. The chosen of Nurgle do not see themselves as monsters. When they look upon their rotting reflection, they perceive beauty and vitality where others would see only corruption. This delusion extends beyond mere visual misperception. They genuinely feel healthy, even robust, interpreting the constant drainage of pus and other fluids as natural secretions, the sloughing of necrotic tissue as simple skin renewal, the presence of maggots and other parasites as symbiotic relationships. This cognitive distortion represents perhaps the deepest level of corruption, the transformation of the mind to match the body's degradation. Nurgle's chosen develop a profound sense of community with their fellow corrupted, a brotherhood forged in shared transformation. They refer to their plague brothers with genuine affection, their bonds of loyalty often exceeding those they felt for their uncorrupted comrades. This fellowship extends to the diseases they carry, which they perceive as gifts to be shared with those less fortunate. When a plague marine spreads pestilence to an enemy, he believes himself to be offering a blessing, a chance for the uninfected to experience the same liberation from suffering that he has found. This missionary zeal drives much of their combat doctrine, with contamination of enemy forces serving as both a tactical objective and a spiritual calling. The armour worn by Nurgle's Chosen tells its own story of degradation and transformation. Power armour that once gleamed with proud heraldry and perfect maintenance becomes a corroded shell fused directly to the wearer's flesh. The ceramite plating develops a patina of rust and verdigris, despite being composed of materials that should not corrode. Joints seize with accumulated filth, but somehow continue to function, grinding and squealing with every movement. The armour's machine spirit, that fragment of consciousness that inhabits all Imperial technology, becomes corrupted alongside its wearer, developing a malevolent awareness that takes pleasure in its own deterioration. Gaps open in the armour plating as the wearer's swelling body forces the ceramite apart, revealing the rotting flesh beneath. Rather than repair these breaches, Nurgle's warriors often cultivate them, allowing chains of bacteria and fungal growths to spread across both armour and skin in decorative patterns. Some incorporate additional organic materials into their war gear, festooning their pauldrons with intestines, mounting severed heads on their backpacks, or weaving hair and sinew through the gaps in their armour. These additions serve no tactical purpose, but fulfill some aesthetic drive, the corrupted warrior's attempt to beautify himself according to his warped perceptions. The weapons carried by Plague Marines undergo similar transformations. Bolters designed to fire explosive rounds with perfect precision become encrusted with filth that should jam their mechanisms but instead seems to enhance their function through supernatural means. Blades that once held monomolecular edges develop jagged, rust-eaten profiles that inflict far worse injuries through the introduction of supernatural diseases than they ever could through clean cuts. Plasma weapons that should explode if poorly maintained instead vent noxious gases with each shot, their containment fields warped by the presence of warp-tainted energies. The Chosen of Nurgle maintain their weapons not through proper care, but through a form of negligent reverence, their gear functioning through the plague god's favour rather than any mechanical principle. Beyond the physical and mental corruption, Nurgle's Chosen develop supernatural abilities that mark them as truly inhuman. They can endure injuries that would kill any natural creature many times over, fighting on with limbs severed, torsos punctured, or heads partially destroyed. Their bodies heal from wounds in ways that defy medical understanding, regrowing lost tissue not as healthy flesh but as more corrupted matter, each injury becoming an opportunity for further transformation. They emanate auras of disease that sicken those around them, their mere presence enough to trigger plagues in population centres or corrupt untreated wounds in enemy soldiers. Some develop the ability to vomit streams of virulent fluids, their stomachs becoming reservoirs of concentrated pestilence that they can project at range. Others discover that their blood has transformed into a substance so toxic that spilling it on an opponent inflicts worse damage than any weapon. The most favoured sometimes manifest smaller entities, Nurglings and other demonic parasites that nest within their bodies and emerge to attack enemies or perform simple tasks. These creatures are regarded with paternal affection by their hosts, who see them as children or pets, rather than the horrifying parasites they truly are. The Chosen of Nurgle also develop a supernatural resistance to the warp powers of other gods. Cornet warriors find their rage-fueled strength diminished when facing Plague Marines, the sheer vitality of Nurgle's gifts overwhelming even the blood god's martial prowess. Slaneshi excess cannot seduce those who have found contentment in decay, their desires already fulfilled in ways that make physical pleasure seem trivial. Xinqian sorcery struggles to affect bodies that exist in a state of constant mutation. The plague. God's gifts providing a form of stability that resists the architect of fate's attempts at transformation. This resistance extends to psychic attacks from non-chaos sources, with many Plague Marines demonstrating an unsettling immunity to powers that would cripple or kill ordinary Space Marines. The faith that Nurgle's Chosen develop in their patron god rivals the fervour that the most devoted Imperial citizens feel for the Emperor. They construct elaborate rituals around the spreading of disease, conducting ceremonies that combine elements of religious worship with biological warfare. They maintain gardens of cultivated plagues, treating each new strain as a beloved creation to be nurtured and eventually released upon the galaxy. They compose hymns in praise of decay, their voices made harsh and bubbling by damaged vocal cords, but their devotion unmistakable. This religious dimension adds another layer to the horror, the understanding that these beings genuinely worship the force that has destroyed them, finding meaning and purpose in their own degradation. The tragedy of Nurgle's Chosen lies not in their suffering, but in their inability to recognize it as such. They have been transformed so completely that the very framework through which they interpret reality has inverted. Where they once fought to preserve life and health, they now spread death and disease with equal conviction. Where they once viewed corruption with revulsion, they now embrace it as the natural order. They are not prisoners in rotting bodies, crying out for release. They are willing participants in their own damnation, evangelists for a creed of decay who genuinely believe they are offering salvation to a suffering galaxy. This makes them far more dangerous than mere victims, for they fight with the conviction of true believers, spreading Nurgle's gifts with missionary zeal that no amount of imperial propaganda or military force can deter. The daily existence of Nurgle's Chosen unfolds in environments that would kill unprotected humans within moments of exposure. Their plague companies establish themselves in regions transformed by their very presence, spaces where the boundary between the material realm and Nurgle's garden in the warp grows thin enough to allow constant interchange. These corrupted zones develop their own ecosystems, complete with flora and fauna adapted to exist in conditions of perpetual decay. Fungi sprout from every surface, their spores filling the air with clouds of infection. Pools of stagnant fluid accumulate in low-lying areas, breeding grounds for diseases that exist nowhere else in the galaxy. The very air becomes thick with particulates of decaying matter, creating a miasma that obscures vision and infiltrates any gap in protective equipment. Within these plague-racked domains, the Chosen of Nurgle establish a mockery of military organization. Plague companies maintain hierarchies based not on rank or merit in the traditional sense, but on the degree of favor shown by their patron god. Those who have received the most blessings, whose bodies showcase the most elaborate transformations, hold positions of authority. These plague champions command through a combination of supernatural charisma and the simple fact that their advanced corruption grants them abilities their lesser brethren cannot match. They organize their followers into squads and detachments, maintaining a structure that echoes their origins in the imperial military or Astartes chapters, though the purpose has inverted from defending humanity to spreading its destruction. The social dynamics among Nurgle's Chosen reveal a disturbing camaraderie that persists despite their physical degradation. They gather in what they consider fellowship halls, spaces within their corrupted domains where they share tales of their greatest contaminations and display new mutations with pride. These gatherings have an almost festive quality, with the Plague Marines expressing genuine joy in each other's company and celebrating the gifts their god has bestowed. They compose crude poetry, praising decay, sing hymns that emerge as gurgling approximations of melody through damaged vocal cords, and even engage in contests to see who can cultivate the most virulent strain of disease. This communal aspect represents a profound perversion of the brotherhood that Space Marines are designed to feel for their battle brothers, that bond of loyalty twisted into something that celebrates corruption rather than virtue. Plague sorcerers occupy a specialized role within these communities, individuals who combine the physical blessings of Nurgle with mastery over the warp's darker powers. These corrupted psychers channel energies drawn directly from their patron's realm, manifesting abilities that weaponize disease in ways beyond mere physical transmission. They can curse enemy commanders from across battlefields, inflicting wasting sicknesses that reduce healthy warriors to emaciated husks within hours. They summon clouds of plague flies that strip flesh from bone with supernatural efficiency. They accelerate the decomposition of enemy fortifications, causing ceramite and plasteel to corrode as though subjected to centuries of neglect in mere moments. The sorcerers themselves pay a terrible price for these powers, their bodies warped beyond even the typical Plague Marine's deformity, often becoming little more than animated sacks of pus and bone held together by sheer force of unholy will. The relationship between Nurgle's Chosen and the demon entities that serve their god creates another layer of horror. Nurglings, small demonic creatures resembling diseased cherubs, infest the bodies and equipment of Plague Marines, nesting in the cavities of their armor and the wounds in their flesh. The corrupted warriors regard these parasites with genuine affection, speaking to them as one might address beloved pets or mischievous children. The Nurglings reciprocate in their own way, performing simple tasks for their hosts and occasionally swarming enemies in combat. More powerful demons, the Plague-Bearers and Great Unclean Ones, interact with the mortal chosen as superiors but not as masters in the traditional sense. There exists a strange equality between demon and mortal in Nurgle's service, both united in their purpose of spreading decay throughout the galaxy. The fusion of flesh, machine, and demon that creates Nurgle's engines of war represents technology taken to its most nightmarish extreme. Demon engines dedicated to the Plague God combine the worst aspects of all three components, resulting in entities that defy categorization as either vehicle, weapon, or living creature. The creation process begins with a machine, typically a tank or walker from Imperial or Chaos forces, which is then subjected to extensive ritual corruption. Tech priests or Dark Mechanicum adepts, themselves already fallen to Nurgle's worship, perform modifications that replace mechanical components with organic matter and bind demonic entities into the vehicle's structure. The machine's spirit, that fragment of consciousness present in all Imperial technology, becomes a screaming prisoner within its own form, its awareness twisted and merged with both demonic intelligence and corrupted biological material. Plagueburst crawlers exemplify this hideous fusion, tracked vehicles that were once Imperial Vindicator tanks or similar assault platforms. The transformation leaves them barely recognizable, their hull plating distended and ruptured, organic matter visible through gaps in the armor, weapons replaced with mortars that fire shells filled with virulent plagues. The crawlers move with a disturbing gait, their tracks grinding and slipping as they propel the bloated vehicle forward, leaving trails of infectious slime in their wake. The crew, if such a term still applies, fuses with the vehicle over time, their bodies merging with control mechanisms until it becomes impossible to determine where the Plague Marine ends and the machine begins. These hybrid entities experience a form of consciousness that encompasses both organic thought and mechanical calculation, perceiving the battlefield through a combination of sensory organs and Auspex arrays, all filtered through the lens of Nurgle's corruption. Blight Haulers present an even more disturbing example. Smaller walkers that scuttle across battlefields on mechanical legs that have developed a grotesque organic quality. Their hulls pulse with what might be breathing, their weapon systems incorporating biological components that spit streams of corrosive bile alongside conventional munitions. The demons bound within these machines express their presence through the vehicle's behavior, causing them to emit sounds that resemble laughter or moaning, to deliberately target enemies in ways that maximize suffering rather than tactical efficiency, and to occasionally refuse commands from their supposed operators in favor of following their own malevolent whims. The largest and most horrifying of Nurgle's demon engines take the form of plague towers and other titanic constructs that tower over battlefields like mobile fortresses of pestilence. These monstrosities combine the scale of Imperial Titans with the organic horror of Nurgle's aesthetic, their legs not pistons and servos but vast muscular appendages wrapped in corroded metal, their torsos not armoured compartments but cavernous spaces filled with diseased tissue and mechanical components in equal measure. Weapons sprouting from these engines fire not just conventional ordnance, but concentrated streams of supernatural plague, capable of infecting entire regiments with a single volley. The entities bound within such constructs possess intelligence and power, rivaling greater demons, their awareness spreading throughout the massive structure, experiencing every impact, every discharge of weapons, every step across contaminated earth as sensation both mechanical and biological. The suffering embedded in these demon engines defies comprehension. The machine spirits that once served loyally in Imperial vehicles find themselves trapped in forms that have become their prisons, forced to participate in acts of corruption that violate every principle of their creation. Any remnant of the Omnissiah's blessing has been inverted, transformed into a curse that prevents the destruction they might otherwise seek. The demons bound within experience a form of limitation they would not face in the warp, constrained by physical form yet unable to return to their patron's realm. Even the biological components, whether they retain fragments of awareness from their origins as human or Astartes tissue, exist in a state of perpetual transformation, never allowed the mercy of final death. All three aspects lock together in a relationship of mutual corruption, each feeding the degradation of the others, in a cycle that continues as long as the engine remains functional. The plague fleets that carry Nurgles chosen across the galaxy demonstrate corruption on a scale that transforms entire vessels into floating ecosystem of disease. Ships that once served in the Imperial Navy or Astartes fleets undergo transformations similar to individual warriors, their hulls becoming porous and weeping, their interior spaces transforming into gardens of pestilence. The Geller fields that should protect against warp incursion fail or become deliberately sabotaged, allowing the energies of the immaterium to seep into the ship's structure. This creates zones where reality operates according to Nurgle's preferences rather than natural law, spaces where time flows erratically, where decay accelerates to impossible speeds, where new forms of life spontaneously generate from pools of corruption. The vessels themselves develop a form of awareness, their machine spirits long since consumed and replaced with something altogether more malevolent. Ships navigate through the warp without conventional pilot input, following courses determined by demonic intelligence or the will of Nurgle himself. They emerge from warp transit in systems where their presence alone begins the process of contamination, their hulls shedding clouds of infectious material that drift through void and eventually fall into planetary atmospheres. Some plague ships are encrusted with so much organic growth that their original configuration becomes unrecognizable, their weapon systems replaced or supplemented with biological equivalents that spit streams of acid or launch pods containing concentrated disease payloads. The crews of these vessels exist in states of transformation that span the spectrum from nearly human to completely inhuman. Recent converts might still perform their duties in ways recognizable to Imperial observers, manning weapon stations and conducting repairs, albeit in environments that would kill unprotected personnel instantly. The most corrupted crew members have fused with the ship itself, their bodies merging with bulkheads and machinery, their consciousness spreading throughout entire sections of the vessel. These hybrid entities serve as living conduits for the ship's corrupted machine spirit, experiencing the vessel's existence as their own, feeling impacts against the hull as blows to their extended body, sensing enemy ships through Auspex arrays as though perceiving them with augmented senses. When plague fleets arrive in systems targeted for corruption, they begin a process of systematic contamination that transforms entire worlds into extensions of Nurgle's garden. The initial stages involve orbital bombardment with specialized munitions designed not to destroy but to infect. Warheads containing concentrated disease agents impact population centers, releasing plagues calibrated to spread through human populations with maximum efficiency. These are not natural diseases, but supernatural afflictions that bypass conventional medical treatment and immunological response. Victims experience symptoms that combine the worst aspects of multiple conditions, their bodies becoming breeding grounds for new and even more virulent strains as the infection mutates within their systems. As planetary populations succumb, the transformation of the world itself accelerates. Plant life begins to die and be replaced with fungal growths and mutated vegetation that thrives on decay. Water sources become contaminated, turning into breeding pools for diseases and parasites. The atmosphere undergoes chemical changes as the dying ecosystem releases gases that alter its composition, making it progressively more toxic to uninfected life, while becoming increasingly hospitable to Nurgle servants. Eventually, the barrier between the material world and the warp weakens to the point where demon manifestation becomes possible, without the need for elaborate rituals, allowing entities from Nurgle's realm to cross over and take up permanent residence. The creation of a true demon world dedicated to Nurgle represents the culmination of this process, a planet so thoroughly corrupted that it exists partially in both the material universe and the warp simultaneously. These worlds become extensions of the plague god's garden, their landscapes transforming into nightmare visions of fecund decay. Mountains of accumulated filth rise where cities once stood, their slopes crawling with mutated life forms. Rivers of viscous fluid wind through valleys, their currents carrying concentrations of disease potent enough to infect entire populations. Forests of fungal growth tower overhead, their canopies blocking out the sun and creating permanent twilight beneath. The air itself becomes a soup of infectious particles, visible as a greenish mist that reduces visibility and infiltrates even the most sophisticated protective equipment given sufficient exposure. Nurgle's chosen establish strongholds on these demon worlds, fortresses that combine military function with the aesthetics of their patron god. These structures appear to grow from the corrupted earth rather than being built upon it, their walls composed of materials that blur the line between stone and ossified tissue. Interior spaces are designed to accommodate the swollen forms of plague marines, while also serving as laboratories where new diseases are cultivated and tested. Gardens fill courtyards, not the decorative plantings of civilized worlds, but carefully tended plots where particularly virulent strains of plague are nurtured like prized crops. Dungeons hold test subjects, prisoners captured from raids who are exposed to experimental infections and observed as the diseases run their courses, their suffering providing data for refinement of the plagues. These demon worlds serve as staging grounds for further corruption, bases from which plague fleets launch expeditions to spread Nurgle's influence to new systems. They also function as recruitment centres of a sort, for the few survivors of planetary infection sometimes embrace the transformation rather than resist it, begging for the relief that full conversion promises. These volunteers join the ranks of the corrupted, their eager acceptance sometimes earning them faster progression through the stages of mutation than those who cling to their humanity until the end. The most devoted may eventually ascend to positions of authority, becoming plague champions or even demon princes if their service proves sufficiently pleasing to Nurgle. Among the chosen of Nurgle, certain individuals stand out for the scope of their corruption and the devastation they have wrought across the galaxy. Typhus, herald of Nurgle and host of the Destroyer Hive, exemplifies the ultimate fate awaiting those who give themselves completely to the Plague God's service. Once a captain of the Death Guard Legion named Callus Typhon, he orchestrated his legion's exposure to the plague that would transform them during the Horus Heresy. His betrayal of Mortarion and his brothers marked him for special favour, and the rewards he has received over 10 millennia of service have elevated him to a state that transcends even typical demon prince existence. Typhus no longer resembles anything human, his body so massively swollen and distorted that his Terminator armour has fused completely with his flesh, the two becoming indistinguishable. Within his form dwells the Destroyer Hive, a swarm of supernatural plague flies that can manifest as extensions of his will or emerge as an independent force. These entities are not separate from Typhus but part of him, their consciousness merged with his own, allowing him to experience existence through thousands of perspectives simultaneously. He perceives the galaxy through compound eyes and human vision, feels through chitinous legs and rotting flesh, thinks with both human cunning and insect instinct. This distributed consciousness makes him nearly impossible to truly kill, for even if his primary body were destroyed, the flies could potentially reconstitute him given time and appropriate circumstances. The devastation Typhus has inflicted on the Imperium over 10,000 years defies calculation. Entire subsectors have fallen to plagues he personally delivered, their populations numbering in the billions reduced to shambling plague zombies or worse. He leads plague fleets on missions of corruption that span decades, systematically contaminating system after system, leaving demon worlds in his wake. His presence on a battlefield represents one of the greatest threats any Imperial force can face, for he does not simply kill his enemies but transforms them, turning Imperial soldiers into plague zombies that rise to fight their former comrades, spreading disease with every shambling step and infectious touch. Other champions of Nurgle have carved their own legends in the annals of corruption. Necrosius the Undying, a former Thousand Sun sorcerer who turned from Tzeentch to embrace Nurgle, combines mastery of necromancy with plague magic, creating armies of enhanced plague zombies that retain fragments of tactical awareness. His experiments in merging the dead with disease have produced new strains of walking plague that spread faster and kill more efficiently than anything Nurgle's garden previously contained. Septicus, a plague champion who has led the same plague company for 7 millennia, has personally overseen the corruption of 47 worlds, each one transformed according to carefully planned stages until it achieved full demon world status. The transformation of newer Space Marine chapters into servants of Nurgle demonstrates that the Plague God's reach extends beyond the original traitor legions. The Purge, a warband whose origins remain murky but who demonstrate fanatical devotion to spreading disease, have embraced Nurgle's corruption so completely that they regard all life as an offence requiring correction through plague. Unlike the Death Guard who spread disease with something approaching joy, the Purge do so with grim determination, viewing themselves as sanitation workers cleansing the galaxy of the contamination that is existence itself. Their interpretation of Nurgle's creed represents an even darker philosophy, one that sees decay not as a stage in a cycle, but as the proper and final state of all matter. Loyalist chapters corrupted more recently carry additional tragedy, for they often retain memories of their service to the Emperor that make their fall all the more poignant. Brothers who once defended humanity with absolute devotion now spread its destruction with equal conviction, their minds so thoroughly warped that they cannot perceive the contradiction. They recite litanies learned in their chapter monasteries even as they unleash plagues on imperial worlds, genuinely believing themselves to still serve humanity's best interests by offering the gifts of Nurgle to those suffering under the Imperium's cruel regime. This delusion makes them particularly dangerous, for they combine the tactical acumen and equipment of loyalist chapters with the supernatural abilities granted by chaos corruption. The experience of those who face Nurgles chosen in battle encompasses a spectrum of horrors that go beyond mere physical danger. Imperial guardsmen confronting Plague Marines for the first time often break before engaging in actual combat, their minds unable to process the sight of being so fundamentally wrong that they violate basic assumptions about what human form should be. The stench alone proves incapacitating, a miasma of decay so powerful that it triggers violent physical reactions even through rebreather equipment. Those who maintain enough discipline to actually engage the enemy discover that their weapons seem inadequate to the task, lasgun fire scorching rotted flesh, but failing to stop the advance of warriors who should be dead 100 times over from their wounds alone. Close combat against Nurgle's Chosen represents the ultimate nightmare for Imperial soldiers. Plague Marines fight with deliberate, unhurried movements, their swollen bodies slow but inexorable, advancing through fire that would stop any normal foe. When they reach melee range, they employ weapons that inflict wounds impossible to properly treat, contaminated blades that introduce infections directly into the bloodstream, plague-encrusted mauls that shatter bone and leave fragments that fester with supernatural diseases. Even minor injuries from these weapons prove fatal without immediate and extensive medical intervention, and in the chaos of battle such treatment rarely comes in time. Soldiers watch comrades transform before their eyes, healthy warriors reduced to plague victims within hours, their bodies swelling and rupturing as accelerated infections run their courses. The psychological impact extends beyond individual battles. Regiments that have faced Nurgle's forces suffer long-term effects that commissars recognize as distinct from normal combat trauma. Survivors report nightmares filled with images of decay, waking visions of their own bodies rotting, paranoid certainty that they carry infections despite clean bills of health. Some develop compulsive behaviors, washing themselves raw in attempts to achieve cleanliness that always seems just out of reach, or conversely abandoning all hygiene in a form of sympathetic corruption. The most severely affected may seek actual infection, their minds broken by exposure to the plague god's influence, genuinely believing that transformation into one of Nurgle's Chosen represents salvation rather than damnation. Civilian populations subjected to plague attacks experience terror on a scale that reduces the individual to insignificance. When disease begins to spread through a hive city, the initial response follows established quarantine protocols, the infected isolated and treated according to standard medical procedures. But Nurgle's plagues do not respond to conventional treatment, and as the infection spreads despite all precautions, social order begins to collapse. Panic drives populations into behaviors that accelerate transmission. Riots, breaking quarantine barriers, desperate crowds mobbing medici facilities, infected individuals hiding symptoms to avoid isolation. The breakdown happens faster than any natural plague, as though the disease itself possesses malevolent intelligence, guiding its spread for maximum devastation. In the final stages of planetary infection, survivors face choices that offer only different flavors of horror. Some choose death on their own terms, preferring quick ends to the slow transformation awaiting them. Others cling to hope long past the point of reason, hoarding useless medications, praying to an emperor who seems deaf to their pleas, maintaining routines even as the world literally rots around them. A few embrace the infection, their minds breaking under the weight of fear and despair, accepting Nurgle's gifts as relief from suffering. These become the most tragic cases, for they genuinely believe themselves saved, their corrupted consciousness interpreting its own degradation as improvement, finding joy in conditions that would have horrified them days or hours before. The Imperium's response to major Nurgle incursions demonstrates the inadequacy of conventional military doctrine against supernatural threats. Exterminatus, the complete destruction of infected worlds, remains the only reliable solution once corruption reaches certain thresholds. Inquisitors authorize these ultimate sanctions with grim regularity when facing Nurgle's plagues, entire planets condemned to death by cyclonic torpedo or virus bomb to prevent spread to neighboring systems. The populations of these worlds die not from the disease that infected them, but from the Imperium's mercy, which takes the form of orbital bombardment reducing their homes to lifeless rocks. This represents success in the Imperium's calculation, billions dead but trillions saved, though the survivors on nearby worlds live forever after, with the knowledge that similar fate awaits them should infection reach their homes. Even Exterminatus sometimes proves insufficient against demon worlds, for planets that have crossed fully into Nurgle's domain exist partially in the warp and cannot be destroyed through purely physical means. These worlds require intervention by Grey Knights or other specialized forces capable of combating demonic corruption at its source, missions that carry casualty rates approaching total loss even for those elite warriors. The knowledge that such worlds exist, that spaces in the galaxy have been permanently claimed by chaos and cannot be reclaimed, weighs heavily on Imperial strategic planning and contributes to the grinding despair that characterizes the setting. The ultimate horror of Nurgle's corruption lies not in its symptoms but in its absolute finality. The Imperium recognizes no cure for those who have accepted the Plague God's gifts, no redemption for the corrupted. Even the Emperor's divine power, channeled through his most faithful servants, cannot reverse the transformation once it reaches certain stages. The corrupted exist beyond salvation, their souls so thoroughly marked by chaos that they cannot be welcomed back into humanity's fold even if some miraculous treatment could restore their physical forms. This permanence transforms infection from a medical crisis into a spiritual catastrophe, each victim not merely killed but damned, their eternal souls claimed by Nurgle to serve forever in his garden beyond death. For those who fight against Nurgle's forces, this knowledge poisons every victory with futility. Battles won against Plague Marines mean nothing in the long term, for the corrupted will return, their demon-blessed bodies regenerating from injuries that should be permanent, their warships rebuilding from wreckage through supernatural means. Worlds cleansed of infection remain vulnerable to recontamination, for the diseases cultivated in Nurgle's garden are preserved eternally, ready to be unleashed again when circumstances favour their spread. The war against the Plague God cannot be won in any conventional sense, only endlessly fought, each victory temporary and each defeat potentially final. This existential dread pervades the Imperium's relationship with Nurgle's forces in ways that exceed even the threat posed by other Chaos powers. Khorne's berserkers can be killed, and their rage ends with their deaths. Tzeentch's schemes can be countered through vigilance and faith. Slanesh's temptations can be resisted through discipline and purity. But Nurgle's gifts require only despair to take root, and despair remains abundant in a galaxy defined by endless war, suffering, and loss. Every Imperial citizen who has buried a loved one, every soldier who has watched his comrades die, every commander who has failed despite his best efforts, carries within them the seed from which Nurgle's corruption might sprout. The Plague. God need only wait, patient as decay itself, for that moment when resistance crumbles and acceptance seems like mercy. The chosen of Nurgle stand as monuments to this awful patience, living proof that corruption always finds a way, that suffering always finds its limit, that even the mighty can be reduced to vessels for disease. They are not defeated enemies but converted ones, their former strength and skill now turned towards spreading the very horrors they once fought against. Each Plague Marine represents a failure not just of the Imperium but of the human spirit itself, a soul that chose comfort in damnation over the hard path of continued resistance. Their existence poses a question that every Imperial servant must eventually confront in the darkness of their own thoughts. When suffering becomes truly unbearable, when death offers no escape and life promises only more agony, what prevents anyone from seeking the relief that Nurgle offers? What keeps any being from taking that final step into willing corruption? The answer, such as it is, lies not in strength or faith or discipline, though all these help. It rests in the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, the core of identity that can choose defiance even when defiance seems pointless. The uncorrupted endure not because they are stronger than those who fell, but because some fragment of their being refuses the comfort of surrender. They fight knowing they will likely lose, endure knowing suffering will continue, resist knowing corruption waits patiently for the moment their guard drops. This is the true horror of Nurgle's Chosen, not that they suffer, but that they have stopped suffering, not that they were defeated, but that they accepted defeat and found peace in it. They are the future that awaits anyone who stops fighting, the fate worse than death that the Imperium's citizens struggle against every day of their difficult lives, the darkness at the end of the path of least resistance. Against this ultimate corruption, only continued resistance matters, futile though it may seem. For to stop resisting is to become the very thing one fears, and that transformation cannot be undone.